It was June 9, 2001, a day so ordinary. No one in the quiet town of Willow Creek suspected it would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. The sun cast a golden hue over the sleepy streets, and families were outside mowing their lawns, watering gardens, or enjoying barbecues. For 9-year-old Emily Turner, it was the perfect kind of day to ride her pink bike. The one with sparkly streamers on the handlebars and a little white basket on the front. She asked her mom if she could take a short ride around the block, just like she'd done dozens of times before. Her mom smiled, reminded her to wear her helmet, and watched her pedal off down the sidewalk. It was 2:43 p.m. Emily never made it back. The Turners lived on a safe, tree-lined street where everyone knew each other by name. Emily had strict boundaries set by her parents just to the park and back. That loop usually took her 12 to 15 minutes, but when 3 o'clock came and went, her mother began glancing nervously out the window. At 3:15, she stepped outside and called her daughter's name. By 3:30, panic began to sink in. The neighborhood was quickly alerted, and within the hour, dozens of residents were walking the streets, knocking on doors, calling her name. Her bike was found tipped over near a trail entrance behind a church 2 blocks away. The front wheel was still slowly spinning. There were no signs of a struggle, no skid marks, no screams reported by any nearby homes. It was as if Emily had simply evaporated. Police arrived quickly and began treating the scene as a possible abduction. Dogs were brought in, helicopters scanned the surrounding woods, and authorities questioned anyone who had been on that street that afternoon. A few people recalled seeing her ride by, smiling and humming to herself. No one remembered anything unusual, no strange cars, no suspicious figures, no sounds of distress. The trail where the bike was found led to a dense wooded area behind an old boarded-up property locals often avoided. The search intensified there. Emily's parents, Mark and Linda Turner, refused to leave the site. They stood by the edge of the woods long into the night, calling her name through tears. Clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, hoping she'd emerge from the shadows. That night, the first of many candlelight vigils was held on their front lawn. News crews arrived by morning, and Emily's face, blonde hair, blue eyes, missing front tooth was plastered across every local station. But despite the town's best efforts, Emily Turner had vanished without leaving even a footprint behind. Authorities feared the worst, but with no clues and no witnesses. All they had was a tipped-over bicycle and a growing void of unanswered questions. The community rallied around the Turners. But unease settled in like a fog. Parents grew fearful. Children were no longer allowed to play outside alone, and rumors began to spread. Some believed she had wandered off into the woods and gotten lost. Others whispered of a predator lurking nearby. For Emily's family, the nightmare had only begun. The hardest part wasn't just the loss, it was the silence. The cruel, echoing silence that came when a mother called for her daughter, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. In the first 72 hours after Emily's disappearance, Willow Creek transformed from a quiet suburb into a town gripped by hysteria. Volunteers poured in not just from the neighborhood but from nearby cities. Local schools closed temporarily so students and teachers could join the search. The fire department coordinated search zones, the police set up checkpoints, and the town hall became a command center buzzing with walkie-talkies, flyers, and maps littered with red marker lines. Helicopters hovered day and night, dogs sniffed tirelessly, and even divers were sent into nearby creeks and ponds. But with every passing hour, hope dimmed. It was like she had never existed beyond that pink bicycle. The media caught wind of the case by day 4. National news outlets arrived, broadcasting live from Emily's street. Her parents gave tearful interviews, holding up the stuffed bunny she slept with every night. People across the country watched, horrified, as yet another child had seemingly been swallowed by the earth. Psychics and self-proclaimed mediums flooded the town with bizarre tips. Some claiming she was taken by a shadow man, others insisting she was still alive in a dark room somewhere. The leads ranged from tragic to absurd, but the police followed everyone, desperate for a thread that might pull the case together. Weeks passed, and with them, the press lost interest. But the town did not. The case had become a grim obsession. Everyone had a theory. Some suspected a drifter who had passed through just days earlier. Others blamed a neighbor with a criminal record, and some began turning on each other. Whisper networks formed. Suspicion clung to every streetlight and park bench. Emily's disappearance had become the dark lens through which the town now saw everything. No one trusted anyone anymore. Willow Creek was no longer the safe haven it once claimed to be. Emily's parents, meanwhile, refused to stop. Linda started sleeping in her daughter's room, holding on to her scent. Mark quit his job to dedicate himself entirely to the investigation. They created a website, posted updates daily, and even hired private investigators over the years, both of whom came back empty-handed. They offered rewards, went on talk shows, and kept Emily's story alive long after the world had stopped listening. Every birthday they held a vigil. Every Christmas, they hung her stocking. Their house remained exactly as it was the day she left, as if freezing time would somehow bring her back. By the third year, even the police began pulling resources. The case was reclassified as cold. The tip line dried up. Emily's face, once lit up on every storefront and lamppost, began to fade, weathered by rain, peeled by sun. But in the hearts of her parents and the few who still clung to hope, a question haunted them day and night. How can a child disappear just 3 blocks from home, without a single soul seeing what happened? 12 years had passed since Emily vanished, and while most of Willow Creek had moved on, a strange silence still hung over one particular house just a few streets away from the Turners' home. It was an old 2-story Victorian at the end of Ridgewood Lane, paint peeling, shutters half broken, the lawn a wild mess of weeds. Kids called it the ghost house and dared each other to ride past it at night. For over a decade, it had stood empty, boarded up and forgotten, with no one daring to go near it. Some said it had been foreclosed after the owner simply up and disappeared. Others claimed it was cursed, that screams had once been heard from inside, but no one ever investigated. The truth had faded into rumor, and the house was left to rot. In 2013, a young couple from out of town, Laura and Ben Whitmore, bought the house at an auction, sight unseen. They were newly married and eager to flip a property to fund their dream of starting a small business. The listing described it as a fixer-upper with strong bones, and the price was unbelievably low. When they first stepped inside, the smell of dust, rot, and mildew nearly knocked them backward. But the layout had potential. Beneath the filth and decay, the couple saw opportunity. Original hardwood floors, vintage fixtures, and a massive attic that could be converted. It was a project, but they were committed. They rolled up their sleeves and began working on the house that same week. The early days of renovation were mostly uneventful, tearing out old carpet, scraping moldy wallpaper, replacing broken windows. But it didn't take long before strange things began happening. Tools went missing, and then reappeared in odd places. Lights flickered, even after the wiring had been updated. At night, Laura swore she heard faint tapping sounds coming from inside the walls, like someone was scratching slowly from the other side. Ben chalked it up to rodents or old pipes, but Laura wasn't so sure. She began to feel watched, especially near the back of the house, where the hallway dipped into a darker, cooler part of the structure. She started leaving lights on even during the day. 2 weeks into their renovation, Ben noticed something strange while removing an old built-in bookshelf on the second floor. Behind it was what appeared to be a sealed panel in the wall, no handle, no hinges, just wood that didn't match the rest of the interior. It was almost perfectly flush, almost as if someone had deliberately hidden it. Curiosity piqued. He called Laura over, and together they pried it open. Behind it, they found a narrow crawlspace, filled with insulation and debris, but deeper inside, something caught the light. It was a small door, barely 5 feet high, nailed shut with thick, rusted nails. There was no indication of it on any of the floor plans or renovation blueprints. Their curiosity turned to unease. Who seals a door like that from the outside? Why was it hidden behind a shelf? Laura wanted to call someone, maybe the police, but Ben insisted they at least look inside before making any assumptions. With a crowbar and heavy gloves, they began pulling out the nails one by one. The wood creaked, the house seemed to groan, and the air grew colder as they worked. When they finally opened the door, it released a heavy, musty smell, the kind that made their stomachs churn. What they saw inside was not part of any ordinary home. It was a small room, windowless and silent, its walls covered in something neither of them were prepared for. The door groaned as it swung inward, revealing a narrow, claustrophobic room cloaked in darkness. Ben reached for his flashlight, its beam cutting through years of dust floating in the stagnant air. The room was no larger than a walk-in closet, with crumbling drywall, a concrete floor, and no light fixtures. It had no windows, no vents, and no sign of natural light. Just for suffocating walls and one haunting detail, a child's mattress, sunken and stained, lay directly in the center of the room. The fabric was torn, its color long faded. But what made Laura step back in horror were the long strands of blonde hair still tangled in the bedding. Covering the walls were crude, childlike drawings, hundreds of them. Some were scrawled in crayon, others etched directly into the drywall with what appeared to be fingernails. The same figure appeared again and again in the drawings. A little girl, standing beneath a sun with no face, always surrounded by tall, looming shapes. Laura began to tremble as she moved closer, realizing that one name was repeated over and over in the margins, scratched again and again into the drywall as if written in desperation. Emily. Some of the scratchings were faint, others deep and jagged like they'd been carved in haste or panic. In one corner, near a warped piece of plywood, was a small pile of broken toys-old dolls with missing eyes, a plastic bracelet, and a rusted charm shaped like a bunny. Laura gasped when she saw it. She recognized the bunny charm from the news, from the missing person flyers plastered years ago around town. Emily Turner had worn one just like it on the day she disappeared. At this point, her hands were shaking too badly to keep holding the flashlight. Something had happened in this room, something far more sinister than either of them had imagined. This was no forgotten storage area. It had been a secret prison. The silence in the room was suffocating, but the feeling was even worse. It was as if the air itself was heavy with pain, oppressive, mournful. Laura turned to leave, but Ben noticed something odd about one of the walls. A section of it seemed newer. The paint slightly different, the plaster less cracked. He tapped on it. It sounded hollow. Someone had patched that part of the wall after the room was originally built. With a mixture of dread and determination, he fetched a hammer and began tearing into it. Behind that patch, hidden deep in the drywall, was an old metal box covered in grime. They carried it outside in silence. Inside the box, wrapped in a filthy bedsheet, were a collection of items that seemed entirely out of place in a house abandoned for over a decade. Several photographs, blurred and yellowed. A child's drawing of a house, this house circled in red crayon. And underneath it all, something that made Laura drop to her knees. A stack of VHS tapes, labeled only with dates. The earliest tape was dated July 3, 2001, less than a month after Emily had disappeared. The last one, October 2009. That was 4 years before the house was sold. 4 years before anyone even realized someone had been living hiding in it. The tapes were handed over to the police immediately. Neither Ben nor Laura had the strength or the nerve to watch them themselves. Forensics teams arrived within hours, sealing off the room, documenting every inch of the space, and carefully removing the contents of the metal box. The tapes were sent to the state crime lab for restoration and analysis. They were old, worn down by time and moisture, some of the labels smeared or barely legible. But the first few were intact enough to view. Investigators braced themselves for what they might contain. No one was prepared for what they actually saw. The first tape opened with a static buzz, then cut to a dimly lit room, the same room hidden inside the house. In the frame sat a little girl, no older than 9, wearing a nightgown and sitting cross-legged on the mattress. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with confusion. She looked directly at the camera but didn't speak. The silence stretched for nearly 2 full minutes before she whispered something. "Can I go home now?" The voice was barely audible. Behind the camera, there was no response, just the mechanical whirring of the recording device and the faint creak of floorboards as someone moved. Tape after tape revealed more of the same. Emily, alone in the small room, visibly thinner, visibly older as the tapes progressed. In some, she was seen drawing pictures on the wall. In others, she was simply sitting in silence, staring into space. There were no clocks, no toys, no windows, just her and the unchanging walls. On one tape dated 2003, she was seen speaking to someone off camera. "Please," she whispered, "I'll be good this time." That was followed by hurried footsteps, the camera falling sideways, and the sound of something slamming hard, then darkness. The footage cut out. Investigators could only assume what happened next by the time they reached the 2009 tape. Emily was no longer a little girl. She looked like a teenager now, thinner, pale as a ghost. But something about her eyes had changed. The terror was still there, but now it was dull, resigned. In this tape, she wasn't sitting. She was standing against the far wall, her arms crossed tightly. She spoke into the camera directly. "He says I'm almost ready, that I'm almost done." Her voice cracked. "I don't know what that means. It was the last time Emily Turner was ever seen on video. The final few seconds showed her placing a drawing into the metal box, and then turning away. That was the last known recording. No tape after that. No more entries. Just silence. Investigators were left shaken. None of them spoke for several minutes after the final video ended. But the worst realization wasn't just that Emily had been kept hidden there for years. It was the knowledge that someone had lived in that house with her, entered that room regularly, and documented everything, without ever being noticed. What happened to her after that last recording? Why had the tapes stopped? And perhaps most hauntingly, had she ever actually left that room alive? The discovery of the tapes set off a firestorm within law enforcement. Investigators now had undeniable proof that Emily Turner had been alive at least for several years after her disappearance. The next logical question was chillingly obvious. Who had lived in that house during those years? Property records showed that the house had once belonged to a man named George Halpern. He had purchased the property in 1999, 2 years before Emily vanished. But what stood out most was that George had mysteriously stopped making mortgage payments in late 2009, right around the time the final tape was recorded. Shortly after that, he disappeared, leaving the house to fall into foreclosure. When investigators dug deeper into George Halpern's background, they uncovered a troubling past. He had worked as a freelance contractor in the early 2000s, quiet, mostly kept to himself, and had no immediate family. But then came the darker details. George had a sealed juvenile record, and in his 20s, he'd been arrested twice for unlawful confinement of a minor, though charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. At the time, no one had linked him to Emily's disappearance. He didn't fit the profile, and police had been focused on more visible suspects: delivery workers, local drifters. George had slipped through the cracks, living just 3 blocks away from Emily's family for years, without a single knock on his door. The biggest break came when a facial recognition scan run through updated databases matched George Halpern's photo with a man arrested in New Mexico in 2012 under the alias David Lyle. He had been charged with attempted kidnapping but managed to post bail and vanish again before trial. Investigators now believed George had been changing names, jobs, and states, possibly for years. But something about the timing was deeply unsettling. He left Willow Creek right after the tapes stopped. Why? What changed? Did something happen to Emily that made him run, or was he planning to return? Local police worked alongside the FBI to trace George's movements. They uncovered surveillance footage from a bus terminal showing him boarding a coach bus just 3 days after his last known address was vacated. In his bag, a camcorder, several worn VHS tapes. But it was the footage from a rural gas station that raised the most questions. In the background, walking behind him, was a blurry figure, young, thin, and wearing what looked like a hospital gown. Authorities couldn't confirm the identity, but the resemblance to teenage Emily was undeniable. Had she been with him, or had she escaped? Even more disturbing was a letter found during a search of one of George's former apartments. It was never mailed, just folded neatly and hidden inside a hollowed-out dictionary. It was written in uneven, shaky handwriting. It read, "She cries less now. She doesn't ask to leave anymore. I think she understands, this is home now. I did what no one else could. I kept her safe." It was signed with just one initial, G. Investigators realized they were no longer simply chasing a missing person case. They were unraveling the mind of a man who believed what he had done wasn't monstrous, but merciful. While law enforcement continued hunting for George Halpern, forensic investigators returned to the house one final time to perform a complete ground scan. Something about the timeline and the tapes ending so abruptly didn't sit right with them. They brought in cadaver dogs trained to detect even faint traces of human remains. For hours, the house yielded nothing new until one of the dogs began barking and pawing aggressively at a section of the kitchen floor. It was an unassuming spot, directly beneath where the refrigerator had once stood. The team pulled back the aging linoleum to reveal a wood panel that sounded hollow when struck. The air in the room shifted, suddenly colder, heavier, as if the house itself was bracing for what they would find next. Beneath the panel was a narrow crawlspace, no more than 3 feet deep, filled with dust, spiderwebs, and decades of filth. But in the far corner, pressed against the foundation wall, was a small bundle wrapped in what appeared to be deteriorated fabric. Investigators carefully removed it and laid it out on a sterile surface. Inside were fragments of a faded cotton dress floral print, child-sized, unmistakably from the early 2000s. Linda Turner later confirmed through tears that it matched The dress Emily had worn the day she disappeared. Next to the bundle was something even more haunting. A small, yellowed tooth, cracked and fragile. DNA analysis would later confirm what everyone feared: both the dress and the tooth belonged to Emily. No skeletal remains were discovered, no full body, just the tooth and the deteriorating remains of her clothing. It made the case murkier. Was it evidence of her death, or just a relic from her time spent in captivity? Had she died in that house? Had she escaped and simply left it behind, or had George moved her elsewhere before abandoning the property altogether? The tapes had ended in 2009, and this dress seemed to predate even those final recordings. Forensic analysis showed that the tooth likely came out naturally, a baby tooth, lost in childhood, but the symbolic weight of it was devastating. The Crawlspace had become a tomb for a version of Emily no one had seen in years. The innocent child, who rode away on her bike and never returned. Detectives now theorized that Emily had been kept in multiple parts of the house, perhaps first in the Crawlspace, then later in the hidden room behind the wall. The presence of her dress in the Crawlspace suggested she may have been moved around as George made modifications to the property. The sealed door, the boarded windows, the soundproofing material found inside the walls. Everything pointed to long-term captivity, meticulously planned. But why leave these traces behind? Why not burn the tapes? Dispose of the clothes? Hide the drawings? Was it carelessness? Or pride? Even more disturbing was a second, smaller panel found inside the Crawlspace, a square of rotted wood leading to what looked like an air duct tunnel, just large enough for a child to crawl through. Investigators followed it until it ended abruptly, directly beneath the floorboards of the room where Emily's bike had been discovered years ago. Lying at the edge of the woods, a chilling new theory formed. What if she had never even left the house? What if the scene had been staged to make it look like she'd been abducted outdoors, when all along, the monster had been hiding her just a few houses away? To this day, the question that haunts Willow Creek isn't just what happened to Emily Turner but how it was allowed to happen. How did a young girl vanish in broad daylight, only to be hidden in a house just blocks away, unnoticed for years? How many times did neighbors walk past that boarded-up house, never knowing what was behind its walls? The man believed to be behind it, Was George Halpern, has never been found. Despite nationwide warrants and sightings, he remains a shadow, constantly one step ahead. Some believe he's dead. Others believe he's watching, waiting. As for Emily, the case remains partially unsolved. Her remains were never fully recovered. No confirmed sighting has ever been validated. But those tapes, those drawings, those desperate whispers caught on grainy VHS are real. Proof that she lived. Proof that she waited. Her parents still keep the porch light on every night, just in case, because in a town like Willow Creek, some stories never really end. They just go quiet until someone finds something again.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.